The first time I saw Hazel Pemberton laugh, she was standing on her front porch in the October rain, holding a broken gutter with both hands like she was trying to reason with it. I had just pulled into my driveway after a 10-hour shift at the city's public works yard in Ottawa, where I spend my days managing road maintenance crews and explaining to people why fixing a pothole takes longer than they think it should. My name is Adam Calloway. I was 31, divorced for 2 years, and very good at keeping my life simple. Deliberately simple, the way you get when you spend a marriage learning that complicated feelings don't simplify on their own. I lived in the left half of a semi-detached on Rideau Crescent, a quiet street that smelled like wood smoke from October through April, and had one of those neighborhood Facebook groups where half the posts were lost cats, and half were passive-aggressive notes about leaf blowers. Hazel lived in the right half. She had moved in the previous spring with her daughter and a truly unreasonable number of houseplants. She was 34, a freelance graphic designer who worked from home and made very good use of the natural light. A widow. That was the word people on the street used when they mentioned her. Always with a particular softness, like they were handling something that might shatter. I tried not to do that. To me, she was the woman who left hand-painted rocks along the front path for her daughter to find. The woman who kept a bird feeder stocked through the worst of February. The woman who had once knocked on my door to return a parcel the courier had left with her and said, when she saw the cardboard box was already sagging from the rain, "Your Amazon order looks like it had a rough commute." I had laughed and thought about it 3 times in the following week. I had also decided, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had already made one expensive emotional mistake, that noticing her was not the same as doing anything about it. She still wore a small gold ring on a chain around her neck. I still had a signed separation agreement that had taught me not to confuse loneliness with readiness. So when I saw her on the porch that Thursday evening, wrestling with a section of aluminum gutter that had clearly lost its argument with the October wind, I told myself I was only going over because standing there and watching seemed worse. "Hey," across a little strip of lawn between our driveways. "You want a hand with that?" Hazel looked over. Rain had flattened her dark hair against her forehead, and her jacket was soaked through at the shoulders. "I've almost got it," she said, in the tone of a person who has absolutely not almost got it. "You're holding it at a 45-degree angle." "I'm holding it at a very intentional angle." I stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. "Where's the bracket?" She glanced to her left. The bracket was on the porch railing. The screws were next to it. The screwdriver was on the top step, which meant nobody had climbed up there yet, which meant this project was newer than it looked. "I was going to get to the screwdriver," she said. "You were going to hold the gutter in place and somehow install the bracket with your mind." I was exploring options. But she was trying not to smile and losing. "Do you have a ladder?" 20 minutes later, the gutter was back up. The rain had softened to a mist, and I was wiping my hands on a rag while Hazel stood at the top of the steps looking up at it with the expression of someone who has won an argument. They weren't sure they'd win. "Thank you," she said. "Genuinely. I've been looking at that thing for a week." It was just a bracket. It was psychological warfare. She pulled her jacket tighter. "Brooke keeps asking me when I'm going to fix it. She's 7 and already disappointed in me." I laughed. Kids are brutal. "She told me last week my macaroni and cheese, and I quote, tasted like a decision." She shook her head. "She's not wrong, but still." I was at the bottom of the steps by then. I should have said goodnight and gone inside. Instead, I said, "Is she home now?" "At my sister's in Canada for the night." Hazel's voice shifted slightly, just enough that I noticed. "I was going to have a quiet evening. Do some work. Fix the gutter." She paused. "The gutter took longer than expected." "Psychologically." "Exactly." She looked out at the street. The maple at the curb had dropped most of its leaves, and they lay against the wet pavement in dark copper layers. "It's her dad's birthday today," she said quietly. I went still. She said it the way people say things they've been carrying for hours, finally setting them down somewhere. I kept busy all day. It helped, mostly. Then Brooke called for my sisters and said, "I miss Daddy today." And I thought, yes, me too. And also I am standing in an empty house and the gutter is broken and I do not know how to be okay at this particular moment. She looked back at me, a little embarrassed now, like she'd said more than she planned to. "You don't have to be okay," I said. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "That's what my therapist says." Smart person. Expensive person. But yes. She glanced down at the step between us. I'm sorry. You came over to help with a bracket and now I'm unloading on you in the rain. It's barely raining. Adam. Adam. Hazel. She gave me a look that was halfway between grateful and exasperated, which I was beginning to understand was one of her natural expressions. I was going to make tea, she said carefully, like she was reading a sentence she'd already revised 3 times. And I made too much soup this afternoon because I always make too much soup. If you haven't eaten. I looked at her. She looked back at me. The porch light caught the rain in her hair. Are you inviting me in because you have extra soup? I said. Or because you don't want to be alone with his birthday tonight? The question came out more direct than I'd intended. For one long second I thought she'd go quiet and retreat, and I'd spend the rest of the evening feeling like I'd overstepped. Instead she said, both. Is that too honest? No, I said. Both is a good answer. I left my wet boots at the door. Hazel's half of the house was the kind of warm that took a while to build. The kind that came from small things accumulated over time. Brooke's drawings were pinned to the wall above the radiator, 30 of them at least, horses and rainbows in what I thought was either a dog or a provincial park. There were stacks of design books on the coffee table with post-its sticking out of them at irregular angles. A half-finished mug of something herbal sat on the windowsill next to a spider plant that looked extremely healthy and extremely smug about it. You want to hang your jacket? Hazel was already in the kitchen, pulling bowls from the cabinet. I draped it over the hook by the door. You have a lot of plants. They don't talk back. Unlike Brooke. Unlike Brooke, she agreed. She has opinions about everything. Last week she told me that my handwriting looks like it's in a hurry. She set the bowls on the counter. She's not wrong about that either, honestly. The soup was a roasted tomato and lentil situation that smelled like a place you'd want to be on a cold evening, which was already doing more for me than dinner usually did. I sat down at the kitchen table and felt, in a way I hadn't expected, entirely welcome. We talked easily. She asked about public works, whether it was as thankless as it sounded. I told her most days yes, occasionally no, and that the best part of the job was working with people who genuinely cared about the infrastructure of a city even though nobody thanked them for it. She said she felt the same way about design, that most of the work was invisible when it succeeded and only visible when it failed. What do you design? I asked. Book covers mostly. Some branding. I used to do more editorial, but the book work pays better and I like it. You can be a little stranger with it. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands around her mug. Last month I designed a cover for a novel about a lighthouse keeper who may or may not be a ghost. I got to use a lot of gray. That sounds like a good month. It was. She smiled. Brooke helped me pick between 2 versions. She chose the ghostier one. Clearly she has an eye. She's terrifying and I'm very proud of her. She looked into her soup. She looks like him. Her father. Same eyes, same way of tilting her head when she's figuring something out. Sometimes it catches me off guard. She said it quietly, the way people say things that are just true and don't need dressing up. What was his name? I asked. Patrick. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Patrick Pemberton. He was an electrician. Very steady person. The kind who remembered everyone's coffee orders and never once made a fuss about it. She paused. He died 18 months ago. Heart, no warning. We were in the middle of arguing about whether we needed a new dishwasher, and then she stopped. And then the world had a before and an after. I'm sorry, I said. She nodded, and this time it seemed to settle somewhere instead of just passing through. I moved here because the apartment was too loud with memory. My sister's nearby, which helps, and Brooke needed a yard. She looked up at me. I didn't expect the neighbors to fix my gutters. It was 1 bracket. You keep saying that. It's true. She gave me a long look. You're very committed to minimizing your own gestures. I didn't have an answer for that, so I didn't offer one. The rain had started again, light against the kitchen window, and the room was warm and the soup was almost gone. And Hazel was looking at me with an expression I didn't entirely know what to do with. My marriage ended, I said, which was not something I had planned to say, because my ex-wife and I spent 3 years being polite to each other instead of honest. We were good at coexisting, terrible at actually being there. I turned my mug in my hands. After it was done, I kept thinking that wanting somebody again would mean I hadn't learned anything. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Did you learn anything? I learned I'm better at honesty now. Still working on the rest. She smiled, small and real. Patrick used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was pretend they were fine when they weren't. He said it took more energy than just telling the truth. She looked down. I think about that a lot. About how much energy I spend pretending. I looked at her. You don't have to pretend with me. The words were simple, but the air between us changed slightly when I said them, the way it does when something true gets named instead of left to hover. She looked up. I know, she said, and her voice was different now. Quieter, but more sure of itself. She stood to clear the bowls, and I stood to help. We were both at the sink when she said, without looking at me, I've watched you leave for work in the morning more times than I'd like to admit. I set the bowl down. I know the sound of your truck, she continued. I know you always check the weather app before you go out even though you're going to get wet anyway. And I know you brought my recycling bin back from the curb twice last winter without saying anything about it. She finally looked at me. I'm not saying any of this to be strange. I just thought, since we're doing honesty, that you should know. My pulse was doing something it hadn't done in a long time. Hazel. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I'm not even sure what I have to offer right now. She exhaled. I wanted to say one real thing tonight. I turned toward her. We were close enough that I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was braced for me to make this awkward, or walk it back or change the subject. I've rearranged my morning schedule twice, I said, so I'd be more likely to run into you at the mailbox. Her lips parted. That's embarrassing, I added. But you went first, so. She laughed, sudden and surprised, and the tension broke. Then she looked at me with something open and unguarded, and I thought, careful, Adam. This matters. Can I stopped. Started again. Is it all right if I kiss you? She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, yes, I'd really like that. I touched her face first, just my palm against her cheek, slow enough that she could change her mind. She didn't. She turned into my hand the way someone does when they've been trying not to want something and have finally stopped trying. Then I kissed her, gentle and unhurried. The kind of kiss that acknowledges there are complicated things in the room and doesn't pretend otherwise. Her hands came to my chest. She kissed me back like she'd made a decision and was at peace with it. When we pulled apart, her forehead rested against mine. Outside, rain tapped at the window. Okay, she said softly, to herself more than to me. Okay? I thought that would feel wrong. She pulled back and looked at me. It didn't. I stayed another hour. We moved to the couch with tea, and Hazel put on a playlist that turned out to be almost entirely late 90s folk music, which she was completely unapologetic about. I told her my most embarrassing karaoke song was Summer Nights from Greece, which I had performed at a work party in 2019, and which my colleague Dave had photographed for posterity. She told me her equivalent was Constant Craving by K.D. Lang, which she had performed at her cousin's Staget in Winnipeg and which she stood by entirely. That's not embarrassing, I said. That's a great song. I cried during the chorus. Still a great song. She laughed again and tucked her feet beneath her on the couch, her shoulder close to mine. The plant on the windowsill dripped quietly. Somewhere a car passed on Rideau Crescent with its wipers going. I didn't stay the night. I thought about it, sitting there with the warmth of the room and the sound of her breathing and the feeling that I hadn't been this present in a very long time. But some evenings deserve to end where they are, so I kissed her once more at the door. Carefully and without making it a promise I wasn't sure how to keep yet, and walked back across the strip of lawn with my hands in my jacket pockets and the rain still coming down. At my door I looked back. Hazel was in the window with one hand raised, just briefly before the curtain fell. I stood there longer than I needed to. The next morning, there was a text from a number I didn't have saved. It said, "This is Hazel. I got your number from the neighborhood group chat. I want you to know I have thought about this for several minutes, and I stand by the decision." I was still in bed. I read it twice. "Did the gutter give you my number voluntarily?" I typed back. "Or was there coercion involved?" Her reply came fast. "The gutter and I have an understanding now. It talks. I fix things. It gave you up willingly. That's alarming. It really is. Also, Brooke is home in an hour, and she will absolutely ask who I'm texting, so I need you to be prepared to be described as the neighbor who fixed the rain thing. I've been called worse. She'll probably also ask if you're my boyfriend. What will you say? There was a pause. Then, I'll say you're someone I like, and that I'm figuring out the rest. I put my phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I got up and made coffee and shoveled the light frost off both our front walks before Hazel noticed, because it was October in Ottawa, and that was going to keep happening. And some things are easier to just do. Brooke was everything Hazel had described and more. She had Patrick's eyes, dark and watchful, and a way of evaluating adults with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. She did not ask if I was her mom's boyfriend on that first meeting. She asked instead if I knew how to skateboard, and when I said no, she said, "That's okay, it takes a while," in a tone that was more generous than I probably deserved. She warmed up in stages. First, she started saying hi when she saw me in the driveway. Then she started showing me her drawings, briefly and without much commentary, the way kids do when they're deciding if you're worth the fuller explanation. By November, she had informed me, unprompted, that her favorite planet was Saturn, that her teacher Ms. Aurora was mostly fine but wrong about reading logs, and that her dad had once let her stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve, and it had been the best night of her life. I listened to all of it. I didn't try to be anything in particular. I just showed up, the same as I always had. Hazel noticed. One evening in November, she and I were sitting on her couch while Brooke did homework at the kitchen table, and Hazel said quietly, "She likes you. She tolerates me. That's how she likes people." She turned to look at me. "She's careful. She's been careful since Patrick died. She doesn't let people in easily." She paused. "Neither do I." "I know," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You're patient." "I'm interested," I said. "There's a difference." She made a small sound. Her hand found mine. We sat like that while Brooke muttered something about fractions and the radiator ticked and the neighborhood settled into its evening. There was a Friday in December when I was supposed to come over for dinner, and I showed up to find Hazel in the kitchen with red eyes and a pot of something she'd clearly been stirring without actually watching. Brooke was at a school concert with Hazel's sister. The house was quiet in the way that amplifies everything. I said her name. She turned around. "I'm having a bad day," she said flatly. "You don't have to stay." "I know I don't have to." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not good company right now." "That's all right." Adam. Hazel. "You don't have to be good company. I'm not here to be entertained." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned off the stove, put the lid on the pot, and walked over and leaned into my chest. I put my arms around her and didn't say anything else. We stood in the kitchen for a while. The fridge hummed. Eventually she said, into my shoulder, "I dreamed about him last night. Patrick. It was a normal dream. Nothing strange, we were just having breakfast. And when I woke up, it took me a few seconds to remember." She exhaled. "I hate those mornings." "I know. I keep thinking it means I'm going backward." "It doesn't," I said. "Missing someone doesn't have a direction." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where did you get that from?" "I made it up just now." She let out a breath against my shoulder that was almost a laugh. "Don't make me laugh when I'm trying to be sad." "Sorry, I'll be worse company." She pulled back and looked at me with red eyes and a small reluctant smile. "You're impossible." "Also interested," I said. "Don't forget that part." We ended up eating the soup on the couch with bad TV on in the background, and Hazel fell asleep against my arm about 40 minutes in, still holding her bowl. I took it from her carefully. I sat there in the dark with the TV turned down low and thought about how long it had been since I had felt necessary somewhere. Not useful, but actually necessary, and how different those two things were. When Brooke came home with Hazel's sister, I was in the kitchen doing the dishes. Hazel was still asleep on the couch. Her sister, whose name was Jen and who had been watching me carefully since October, looked at the scene and then looked at me and nodded once, which I chose to interpret as approval. Brooke looked at her mom asleep and then looked at me. "Did she eat the soup?" "Most of it." "Good. She forgets to eat when she's sad." She set her backpack down. "I'm going to bed. You can stay if you want." I didn't stay. But I sat with Hazel for another half hour after Brooke went upstairs, and when Hazel woke up groggy and embarrassed, I handed her a glass of water and said nothing about it. She grabbed my sleeve before I left. Adam. Adam. Yeah, thank you. She looked up at me, still half asleep, her voice quiet and genuine. Not for tonight specifically, for all of it. I didn't trust myself to say much. So I kissed her forehead and told her I'd see her tomorrow, which I would, because I live next door and because at this point, tomorrow was somewhere I wanted to be. February came cold and clear, the particular cold of an Ottawa winter that doesn't apologize to anyone. Hazel and I had settled into something that didn't have a clean label, but felt real in every way that mattered. She texted me when something was funny. I texted her when something wasn't, on the weekends. The three of us went to the Ratto Center or the Museum of Nature, where Brooke had strong opinions about the dinosaur exhibit, or we skated on the canal when the conditions were right, which Hazel was surprisingly good at, and I was less surprisingly not. You're leaning wrong, Brooke told me, for the third time. I'm leaning experimentally. You're going to fall. I'm aware of the risk. I fell. Brooke found this very funny. Hazel helped me up and then also found it very funny. On a Saturday in March, Hazel asked if I would go somewhere with her. She said it carefully, watching my face. I said yes the same way, and let her decide the rest. The cemetery was in the east end of the city, quiet and snow-patched. Birch trees at the fence line just beginning to consider spring. Hazel carried yellow tulips, which she'd said were his favorite. Not roses, he always thought roses were too formal for everyday use. Brooke held my hand on the walk-up, which I hadn't expected and which required me to look at the sky for a moment. Patrick Pemberton's stone was modest. Beloved father, husband, son. Hazel stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Hi. It's been a while. I know." I looked away. She squeezed my hand. "Stay," she said softly, and I understood she was talking to me. She told him about the winter. About Brooke skating and her new obsession with the solar system. About the book covers and the gutter bracket and the neighbor who'd helped with both. Then she looked at me. Her face was wet, but she was steady. "This is Adam," she said, to the stone, to Patrick, to whatever version of him existed in the cold March air. "He's patient when I'm not, and he's very bad at skating, but he keeps trying, and Brooke lets him help with her homework sometimes, which she does not do lightly." Her voice caught briefly. "I think you would have liked him. And I think—" She stopped. Her hand tightened around mine. "I think you'd want me to stop carrying everything alone." I couldn't speak. Brooke, beside me, leaned against my arm in a way she'd only started doing recently. Quiet and certain, like it was something she decided without needing to announce it. Hazel looked at me. Her eyes were full and honest, and she said, "I love you, Adam. I'm pretty sure I have for a while, and I just needed to say it somewhere real." I stepped toward her. My throat was tight. "I love you, Hazel Pemberton." I looked at Brooke. "Both of you. For the record." Brooke looked up at me. "I know," she said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she'd already worked out. "I've known for like 2 months." Hazel laughed through her tears. I kissed her there between the tulips and the spring gray sky, gently, the way you kiss someone when you know the weight of what they're offering you. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like standing at a beginning with your whole history at your back and choosing forward anyway. By the fall, her books were on my shelves. My work jacket lived on her hook by the door. Brooke had claimed the corner of my couch for homework, a fact she communicated not by asking, but by simply appearing there with her backpack one Tuesday evening and staying. We didn't make grand announcements. There was nothing to announce. We just lived close enough and honestly enough, and the distance between our two halves of the house became something more like a habit than a boundary. On the first real snowfall of the next winter, Hazel and I stood in the driveway watching it come down, white and quiet on Rado Crescent. "I shall learn to fix gutters properly," she said. "I can teach you." "Will you be patient?" "Extremely patient. Annoyingly patient. You'll wish I were less patient." She bumped her shoulder against mine. "That's very much something you would say." "It's a talent." She looked up at the snow, then at me, with that expression I had come to know well, the one that was half challenge and half warmth, and entirely her. What was it you said that first night? In the kitchen? I said a lot of things. You said you weren't sure wanting someone again meant you hadn't learned your lesson. She tilted her head. Do you still think that? I looked at her. At the snow in her hair. At the porch light burning warm behind her. No, I said. I think wanting was the lesson. She smiled slowly. Then she took my hand, right there in the driveway in the first snow, and held it the way she always did now. Not carefully, not tentatively, just held it, like it was hers. Inside, the lights were on. Brooke's voice floated out through the window, asking nobody in particular where the good scissors were. Hazel squeezed my fingers and turned toward the door. I followed her in out of the cold. I think about that first evening a lot. Not the gutter, not the rain, not even the soup. I think about the moment Hazel said both, and how much courage it takes to admit that you need more than one thing at once, that you're cold and sad and lonely all at the same time, and that asking for help with any one of those things means admitting the others exist too. What I've come to understand is that how you show up for people tends to determine what finds its way back to you. Not as some cosmic transaction, not as reward and punishment, but as simple cause and effect between human beings. I showed up without an agenda. I fixed the bracket. I stayed for soup. I listened without trying to solve anything. And because I did those things consistently, without needing credit for them, something real had room to grow. That's not luck. That's just what happens when you treat people's grief with enough honesty to sit beside it instead of trying to talk them out of it. Hazel taught me something about what I'd call genuine decency, the kind that isn't performed for anyone's benefit. She wore Patrick's ring on a chain for 18 months, not because she was stuck, but because she was honest about where she was. She didn't pretend to be further along than she was. She didn't rush towards something new to outrun the hard parts, and when she finally said, "I love you," out loud in a cemetery with tulips in her hand, it meant something real, because it had been earned through all that honest waiting. That's the kind of integrity I want to have. In relationships, in friendships, in the quiet everyday moments where nobody's watching. Brooke is the one who surprised me most though. 7 years old, careful and watchful. A kid who had already learned that loss was real and that not everyone who showed up would stay. She didn't give me her trust because I fixed something or made her mom smile. She gave it slowly, in stages, the way smart people do. Showing me her drawings, telling me about Saturn. Leaning against my arm at the cemetery without announcing it, she understood something I had to work to understand myself, that real connection doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes true. There were months where I could have given up, where the pace felt slow, where I wasn't sure what I was to either of them, where the weight of their history felt too large to be next to without getting it wrong. What kept me from walking away was the same thing that had walked me across the lawn in the rain in October, the belief that showing up, even imperfectly, matters more than showing up only when it's easy. That kind of persistence isn't stubbornness. It's a choice you make over and over, quietly, without ceremony, because you've decided that something is worth the long way around. I'm not the same person I was before that October evening. I'm someone who understands now that wanting a life with people in it isn't a weakness or a lesson you failed to learn. It's actually the whole point.